Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Paul Cowlins, naturopathic physician and former professor of naturopathic medicine in Portland, Oregon. And welcome back to my series on salutogenic terrain medicine, where I ask how we might expand the current conceptual models used in medicine, including so-called natural medicine, in order to arrive at a more comprehensive understanding of the human being, health, and disease. Please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe if you find this content valuable. And this is going to be a continuation of the last lecture. This is number 4 in the series. I'll include a link to the last lecture in the description below, so you might want to go ahead and watch that if you haven't already, in order to follow along here. So all along here, I've been exploring this idea of conceptual models and how we come to know, and the metaphors that the conceptual models are based on. And how they mold our understanding of what we actually see. So the central premise here is essentially that what we think and how we think determines what we see. And my thesis is basically that some of the problems of modern medicine, so-called biomedicine, for example, are struggles with how to comprehend and work with chronic disease, but even things like healthcare worker burnout, overemphasis on specialization, the kind of pharmaceutical approach and compartmentalization of different diseases and so forth, increased costs and so forth, that all of these arise not just from administrative or organizational issues, but they are coming from partly the ways of thinking that we're using to approach the human being, health and disease. And these ways of thinking really have their origins in the scientific revolution in the early 1600s in the West, and really came into medicine in the middle of the 1800s. And since then, we've really gone down a road of a particular way of perceiving the body, but also the human being in general. And that this has, I'm arguing here, has limited us into only seeing one aspect of the human being. A lot of people talk about this idea of natural medicine, maybe as a solution to some of the healthcare problems that we're seeing, especially maybe helping us develop a better understanding of chronic disease and how we might care for it. But I would argue that a lot of the sort of discussion in natural medicine currently is simply taking the same thought structures used in the biomedical worldview, and I've talked about some of them in the last lectures. For example, the whole philosophical thinking, the whole ontology of biomedicine, which is based in metaphysical naturalism, the idea of materialism, that really it's the substances that we should be studying, and that those substances are really what we need to work with and give us therapies and so forth. I'm arguing here that there are perhaps other dimensions that we're neglecting and that we're missing. So when we talk about natural medicine, you have to be careful to say, just using a natural product doesn't mean you're essentially thinking differently. And unfortunately, what happens is using the sort of current ways of thinking and applying that to natural products, we end up with this phenomena of patients, for example, walking out with shopping bags full of supplements. And the question is this really different than a shopping bag full of pharmaceutical medications? On one level, we can say it's more natural, it's supporting the body and so forth, but is that really true? These are assumptions we're making, and so I want to really explore that in more depth. I've argued that the conceptual models we take really take on the form of paradigms. They form our paradigms. These are our patterns of thinking and thought. And the paradigms really have two aspects, the so-called epistemology, or ways of knowing, and then the ways of knowing give rise usually to our ontology, or belief about what's actually in the world and what makes up reality. And I argue that modern science and medicine have a very specific ontology, which is based on assumptions which are not necessarily scientifically testable, in the sense that we can't apply the scientific method to prove them in any sort of way. There are assumptions we make as we form our hypotheses. For example, that the body is a biochemical machine, and so we're going to look then at the parts of the machine, the biochemicals, the molecular biology, and the genetics, and then from that we assume that will give us an understanding of the whole human being, including all aspects of a human being, the life activities, consciousness activities, and even self-awareness activities. The assumption is all these somehow arise from matter. That's not a scientifically provable statement. That is an assumption. And so that forms one of these sort of areas of medicine which a lot of people, when they say something is scientific, they're arguing, well, it doesn't align with the metaphysical assumptions of modern science. And I would argue that you can have a method of medicine, approaches to medicine, which are scientific. In other words, they can form hypotheses and we can test those using evidence. But that the hypotheses may not come from the same belief systems of current biomedicine. So if we look at the ontologies of modern medicine, I argue this idea of metaphysical naturalism, the belief in materialism, reductionism, and mechanism, as well as this giving rise to the so-called pathogenic cellular model of disease, that we focus on disease processes and try to stop disease at the molecular level, usually with so-called anti-therapies. And this can be done with pharmaceuticals or with natural products. So that way of thinking is the pathogenic cellular way of thinking. Opposed to that would be the so-called salutogenic way of thinking, which is more, or salutogenic terrain way of thinking, which is more characteristic of traditional medicines. And I want to get into that in more depth as we go. A second aspect to the paradigm is that a lot of these thought structures are really derived from metaphors that we take from simple phenomena in nature, and then we apply them to more complex phenomena. So in the case of biomedicine, the metaphor I've spoken about here is that we use the metaphor of warfare to think of disease as something we must fight, therapies as being an anti-disease, and we must, create more and more precise and targeted kinds of therapies. Versus salutogenic models of healing emphasize more of a maybe gardening metaphor or tuning a musical instrument metaphor, where we work on nourishing the inner conditions that maintain physiology, for example, or healthy psychology, psychosocial life, and so forth, our thought life. If we maintain that, then we'll have more resistance to illness and disease. And that was a salutogenic model based on Antonovsky's work that I spoke about in the previous lectures. So in the last lecture, I introduced this idea that comes to us from many sources. I mentioned the ideas of the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner, who lived from the 1860s and died in 1925, and then how Steiner's work was based partly on the work of the German poet and polymath J.W. von Goethe. Goethe really was interested, especially in the evolution of so-called natural philosophy in his time in the late early 1800s. And he was a little alarmed at what he was seeing in that scientists or natural philosophers at that time were moving towards a specific type of thinking, which Goethe argued was only able to grasp the mineral element in nature, what has already died. And Goethe's real interest was working with plants, for example, and asking, do we need a different type of thinking to work with the organic? Does organic life need a different thinking than mineral thinking, which is very much the thinking we use in physics and chemistry? So he argued that we could develop a sort of delicate empiricism that wasn't based on the classic subject-object divide, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. In the early 20th century, there was a school of phenomenology, and the phenomenologists also spoke about this idea of how the human being, the human observer, interacts with what it's observing. So looking at this idea that what we observe out there, and then the observer, the subject, and the object, how are they connected? And that was the discussion of the schools of phenomenology. And in particular, I related last time this notion of the Greek 4 elements: earth, water, air, fire. It's a very ancient idea, but that modern phenomenologists have sort of asked, are those really representative of 4 states of consciousness, 4 states of knowing? And that through each state we see different things. So the simplest state we're mostly familiar with is the so-called earth solid cognition, and that is thinking like a mineral. And that allows us to see structural, spatial aspects of phenomena. That's really substance-based and quantitative or analytical thinking. So how much of something, what's in there, let's measure it, And so we think in terms of life, for example, as substances, but even when we're talking about consciousness as substances, as dopamine or serotonin, we can say those are correlated with different mental emotional states, and we think less and less now actually than previously. But that these molecular substances are not the same thing as life or consciousness. They are material aspects that we can measure and quantify, but they're not the whole thing. Earth thinking is very objective thinking. And this was, again, the basis of modern science. And in fact, the early empiricists, such as John Locke in the 1600s, argued that really only observations we make that can be weighed and quantified are real. And the things like our subjective impressions, like color and taste, or our feeling states, are not real. They're subjective, and they should be excluded from science. And later scientists and natural philosophers really developed that way of thinking, which gives us our current scientific enterprise. The Earth solid cognition is really one based on separation. You separate the subject from the object, the observer from the observed. And we think that there is that possibility. And this gives rise to what some have called the onlooker consciousness. We just look upon nature and we see it's out there, but then we have our mind in here. The question is, how are they connected? And this is where I'll just briefly touch on what I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, that philosophers like Rudolf Steiner argue that actually it's the thoughts we form. They're not just in our head, they're actually universal, and they're in the phenomena that we're observing. And so if we're able to develop a very calm inner state of observation of our thoughts, and we try our best to become aware of our preconditioned thoughts and our prejudices and biases, we can start to arrive, not fully, we can start to arrive at a sort of objective subjectivism, where our inner thoughts, feeling impressions actually tell us something about the phenomena that we're observing. But in Earth solid cognition, we don't pay attention to that. We just pay attention to, these weighable quantitative things like the amount of molecules and so forth. And this, if we apply this gives rise to the physical organization. It allows us to see the physical organization in nature, the mineral aspect of nature. And again, much of physics and chemistry is based on that mineral aspect in the laws of the mineral world and how they fit together. So the laws learned in classical physics in particular in chemistry are based on that mineral kind of thinking. This creates, of course, a deep problem in terms of we come out of Earth thinking feeling very separated from nature and from other human beings. And so this is a deeper philosophical issue is, okay, well, that way of cognition is essentially separating us from nature, for instance, and others where we feel like we don't have a connection anymore. So that is one of the deeper aspects of Earth solid cognition. I mentioned the possibility of a water fluid cognition. And we can say here, instead of thinking like a mineral, we think like a plant. And that is to get into the actual growth processes of a plant, see how it unfolds in time. It's a really beautiful process, how although the matter of the plant is changing through time, it often maintains the same shape over time. So there's some sort of organizing principle that's taking the matter, the mineral substances, phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, to a higher level of organization than we see in the mineral. Just knowing the laws of chemistry alone is not enough to help you describe how a plant will form. Even knowing the genome of a plant won't tell you what its ultimate shape will be and how it will form in time. So there's some other principle at work here, and that is what water fluid cognition that Goethe, for example, and Steiner argued was required to observe that. And this allows us to see life activities, which are not really solid. They're processes in time. They're not static. They're rhythms and relationships, polarities. For example, more qualitative thinking is needed when you think water-like way. And many traditional medicines, like so-called humoral medicines, use qualitative thinking. Dry and damp, hot and cold, these qualities, instead of saying there's a certain amount of a cytokine, IL-6 or TNF-alpha, that's an earth way of thinking about what the ancients would have put in a more qualitative way. So life then becomes, if you really study it, not a thing, but an activity, a process. We can say earth thinking really gives us the nouns of nature, and water thinking allows us to see the verbs, what is active in putting this together. Steiner called this way of thinking imaginative perception or imaginative thinking. We form inner pictures, and these pictures morph through time. Unlike intellectual thinking, which is very static, and it looks at the parts and the pieces and how they're separated from one another. And again, many traditional medicines, for example, traditional and classical Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, these are so-called humoral medicines, are based in a water fluid cognition largely, very different than our earth-based biomedical thinking. And if we apply water cognition to the body, we get the sense that there is an actual fluid organization which has an independence although it helps to form the physical solid organization. When you study a corpse in medical school, you're seeing the solid organization. The fluid is gone. It's dried up or it's filled with other preservatives, but the activities in the fluid are gone. And these are difficult to capture in a picture because they're constantly moving. So to develop an anatomical atlas of the fluid body would be very challenging. But we would see over time certain structures stay. And that is what's very interesting in the body, is that although, over the course of years, you're changing your matter out, and some estimates are every 7 years we change all of the matter out in our body, the overall form maintains relatively the same. We can still recognize a person after those 7 years, even though they don't have the same matter they had before. So the substances are all changed out, but yet there's a memory, some sort of feel that keeps it all together, and this can be perceived through the water fluid organization, which I'll go into. And then we can begin to see patterns in that fluid organization, which will be important in medicine to say that there are different states of the fluid body, and these can be important when looking at illness processes, for instance. And then a third type of cognition would be the air-gas cognition, and that is thinking more like an animal. We can say animals really have a physical body, they have their life activities, but there's also an additional element related to sensation, feeling, and reaction. Now, people would argue, well, plants have evidence based on, for example, Baxter's polygraph tests of being sensitive to feeling life and whatnot. But we're talking about a different type of sensitivity here and the ability, for example, for movement and whatnot. Plants move, but they move by growing. For example, the cells within them fill with water, and that pushes the cells in one direction. So a flower head can follow the sun. That's very different than an animal with a muscle, which is able to react, and it has a nervous system. So the nervous system is really something that becomes more apparent when we begin to enter into air-gas cognition. We see the inner rhythms, for example, of breathing and circulation and whatnot. These are really non-spatial, non-temporal when you get to a level. We think in terms of, when we perceive an animal, we can see that there's also feeling states. We can maybe relate to the feelings of an animal or another person, of course. So this is also sometimes referred to as feeling perception. Steiner called it inspirative perception or thinking. And this allows us to, again, physiologically maybe see the movement of gases and the role of gases in the body, but also on the psychological level, air cognition allows for the perception of feeling states. And so that's an interesting question to say, do our feeling states correlate not so much with biochemicals, for example, solids like dopamine and serotonin molecules, but rather more gases? Is our gas body, if we could take a picture of it, a picture of our emotional body at every given moment? It's, of course, changing in time and whatnot. Now, I mentioned that there has been this connection with the air and the gas element, especially in nature with the atmosphere and light phenomena. And this gives rise to the question of whether or not we have an inner light body. And that'll be a discussion for a whole video I hope to have coming up here. And the idea that we have actually measured internal light, so-called biophotons, and we have an inner light organization in a sense. And that is correlated with that air-gas body that we see through air-gas cognition or inspirative cognition. And then we can see patterns in that air-light body that would correlate with our feelings. So patterns of feeling states, and many who really are sensitive on this area will talk about perception of colors. Now, this is not just seeing a color like with the eye, but rather perception of the inner mood of a color, the inner experience of a color. And we have that in our language. We talk about how people are green with envy, or maybe they feel blue today, red with rage. These color states, these color descriptions are often correlated with our emotional states historically. So that's the third level of cognition, air-gas cognition, allowing us to perceive a air-gas light body. And then the fourth level of cognition would be fire-warmth cognition. And that is to think essentially like a human. Now, this is going to be very controversial because we think humans are just animals. But, with an animal, there are emotions, there are sensations, there's a nervous system, there are inner feeling states, they react, and so forth. So that is one level of consciousness. But the ability to look in upon one's thoughts, instincts, feelings, to change them over time, to reflect on them, some might argue is a separate capacity. Now, there's maybe not a clear distinction between the human realm and the animal realm in that sense. We know animals have very high, and in some cases, very high cognitive capacities and the ability to learn and so forth. But if we just take this idea that there are, in addition to our basal, instinctual, sensory, emotional life, is a sort of a higher realm of maybe higher values and ideals, the ability to tap into creativity and to actually go against the grain in nature to do something different. And in a sense, an animal would follow natural instinct brilliantly to produce different things and go about certain activities. But you say human beings have this capacity to either go against nature, which has been a big problem, of course, or we can develop novel solutions, maybe inspired from nature, but done differently than what we see in nature. Where is that coming from? And that's where philosophers have argued there's coming from a different space, almost outside of nature, in connection with the more archetypal realm. And so perception of archetypes and higher organizing principles, values, and ideals, this is something we can perceive through a fire or warmth cognition. Now, warmth cognition allows us to perceive warmth on the physiologic level, psychological, but also on this higher mental, even spiritual sense. And in the case of the philosopher Rudolf Steiner, he argued that the thinking itself is a spiritual activity if we do it in a certain way. That really what we're tapping in with our thoughts is a spiritual realm. Or we would call a spiritual realm, versus with the air-gas organization, we're tapping more into what some have called the soul realm. So in the sense of Rudolf Steiner, in anthroposophy, for instance, soul and spirit are separated. Even going back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, he spoke about the so-called vegetative soul, more the life activities, the animal soul, and then a human, more mental soul, which is what I'm speaking about here, that is perceivable through the fire warmth cognition. This again is non-spatial, non-temporal, and again it's related more not to life or just consciousness activities, but self-awareness, self-consciousness. And this is where we can essentially merge into the essence of a phenomena. Some have referred to this as thinking from the heart, a direct experience of another phenomena. Steiner calls it intuitive thinking. And when he uses these words, imagination, inspiration, intuition, he uses them with a capital I to differentiate them from the common meanings that we give. Intuition is often given, like anything that's not intellectual, we call intuitive. But Steiner and others have argued there's actually distinct variations here between intellect and intuition. Imagination, inspiration fall between on a spectrum. Perception of the warmth organization is something that we can see, that essentially our warmth is not just random in the body, has an organization to it. And we can see that starting with things like spectral imaging. We can use infrared imaging and see that the warmth actually has patterns on the skin, and it's usually symmetrical, but in disease states it's asymmetrical. Or, for example, our 24-hour temperature rhythms tend to be disturbed in illness processes like cancer. And so this is where we can think of that warmth organization as a separate body, a separate independent organization, which is integrated with the air, light organization, with the fluid organization, and with the solid organization. And this fire warmth cognition, again, is connecting us with not just something physical, but also to the world of our ideas, our values, our even what we might call morals. That's something that we perceive through this warmth fire cognition. Love itself would be an ultimate feeling state in that warmth kind of capacity. And in fire warmth cognition, this is something that goes beyond separation. When you're warmly connected and attached to something, or warmly observing something, there's no separation, or very little separation between you and what you're observing. You merge with it. And this leads to moments of this sort of direct knowing of another person or a phenomena in nature. This is more what we might glean by reading a poem, is to have this direct experience. And so this is all aspects of the fire warmth cognition. A final word I want to say about that is that essentially the fire warmth cognition and All the others really are different gradations on the scale of separation between subject and object. So the greatest separation between us as observers in the outer world, patient, phenomena, nature, essentially is based in earth cognition, and that's the greatest degree of separation. In watery observation, water perception, we merge a little bit with what we're seeing. To perceive in a qualitative way, you have to kind of merge in with it and get the experience of the, for example, if you're, for example, palpating a patient, you basically can feel different fluidic processes, rhythms, and whatnot. And you have to sort of merge a little bit into that. You can't just step aside and be fully objective and not attached or not connected in that way. Now, again, there's a question of observing in this sort of way, but being able to pull away to some degree and remain somewhat objective while you're making that subjective observation. That's a very difficult, and that's what, again, Goethe called delicate empiricism, a very difficult process to do here. But this leads to more of a participatory consciousness, where we're participating in what we're observing. We're not just thinking ourselves as separated from it. Going into air cognition requires even greater merging with the feeling state of what you are observing. So the inner impressions of feelings that come to us when sitting with a plant or working in nature, or maybe if you're a clinician working with a patient, those feeling states are good to notice and not to dwell on, but simply to take almost like a sensory observation. Why am I feeling this way around this particular person? And then the deeper question is it triggering something within us, or is it a perception coming from that other, or both combined? And so that's where you need a lot of experience and a lot of self-observation to be able to do that kind of observation appropriately. And then finally, in warmth cognition, we merge completely with what we're observing. And so that's where there is no separation, and we feel at one with that being observed. So these higher states of knowing, the imaginative, inspirative, intuitive, the water, air, and fire states of cognition, if we're to develop them, really requires that a tremendous amount of inner development. And that's where Goethe in particular argued that a scientist, again, scientist wasn't really a word that was used in Goethe's time, but we use it today, a scientist or a natural philosopher really has to be very self-aware and very aware of the kinds of thoughts that they're using and when working with phenomena. And really good scientists who study a phenomena for 20, 30 years, that is the focus of their research every day, day in, day out. You say they are being inspired when they go into sleep, for instance, by the thoughts in that phenomena. This would be according to Steiner and others. So the thoughts think themselves into us if we prepare ourselves in the right way. So being a scientist, a clinician, a doctor, a healthcare provider requires that we're very aware of our own personal baggage that we bring into the encounter, because that will change the nature of the encounter, but also what we're taking from that encounter. And then that will affect our clinical decision making. So if one already has a self-imposed model that a patient has a certain condition, and no matter what they say or what you observe, you just impose that model on them, then you're going to miss perhaps what the underlying phenomena is. And this is easier said, of course, than done, because it's very difficult, especially in a busy practice, if you're a clinician, to constantly step back and be sensitive to what you're actually observing here. But it's an ideal we can strive for. And especially in doing medical research, this is, I think, something very important. So it requires a tremendous amount of inner development. In the anthroposophical schools of thinking, which is what Rudolf Steiner helped inspire, anthroposophy really is sort of the wisdom of the human being, or what is the knowledge we need to develop to become human beings. Steiner argued that these kind of more delicate senses, more delicate modes of cognition, the water, air, and fire cognition, can be developed through different artistic and meditative exercises. And so it requires a tremendous dedication for us to do that. It's not like just the scientists who can be talking about, the party last weekend, doing whatever they're doing, not being engaged or being attentive to what they're observing and working with. One has to be fully kind of connected with that phenomena. And then we can go through the different stages of being fully separated in observation and then moving gradually toward more a warmth connection with that phenomena that we're observing. And this can happen over, moments, or it can take days, weeks, months, years, when maybe in a relationship working with someone, we're going to get to different levels of our connection with them depending on the types of cognition we're using. Now, usually we're completely unaware of these states, and so I think that's why I'm really spending time to lay this out, to say that, okay, we don't really separate all of these, we merge them together often, but it's important to know which level of cognition we're jumping to. And I found one of the really difficult things in so-called integrative medicines or traditional or alternative medicines, complementary medicines, is that, again, we're taking different historical practices, for example, in Ayurveda and classical Chinese medicine, and we're trying to look at them through the lens of modern consciousness, which is very much based in earth thinking. So even though students who go to so-called natural medical schools, naturopathic school and whatnot, are really trained, in fact, their prerequisites require them to be trained in earth cognition. And that's a starting point. And it's a very important starting point. But the argument I'm making here is that we can go beyond that and start with the earth cognition. For instance, when one studies physiology, to learn in anatomy, to learn all the parts of the body, how they fit together, and so forth. But then we need to start jumping into a perception of the fluid organization and how that is working within the whole human being, but also each organ. The gas-light organization and how that's working throughout the body and each organ, and then through the warmth organization. And I pointed out that there's a connection with the fluid organization in the endocrine system, the gas-light organization with the nervous system, and the warmth organization with the circulatory and immune systems. So this idea of neuroendocrine immunology is really important as a earth way of working with these different levels that we perceive when we apply the more nuanced ways of perception to the human being. So that will be a grounding point, looking at the neuroendocrine immune system in different conditions. And the point of all of this is to arrive at actually meaningful clinical applications. How do we look at a patient with migraine or hypertension or type 2 diabetes, and how can an expanded way of thinking help us understand that a little bit differently than just the typical approaches we use today. So instead of just saying, well, we need to use a certain class of medication or something, let's look at the state of the neuroendocrine immune system. Let's look at the state of the organ systems, the patterns in the organs, both physiologic in the water body, but also, we might argue, psychologically. And that will be a very important finding as we go forward, that if we think of, for example, the air-light body as related to our emotional life and our psychology, that it has a distinct connection with the fluid body. That the air, in a way, the nerve activities that the air body works through, and again, I'm using these words very loosely, and I'm going to have to go and have a whole different discussion on each of these, and lay out some of the scientific evidence from earth thinking that we can use to understand this. But basically, if we think about that air, light, consciousness body interacting with the fluid body in our life activities, we find there's a constant dance between our consciousness, light, air activities overwhelming the fluid body, devitalizing it, causing illness, and then the fluid body with the life activities regenerating that, especially during sleep when consciousness leaves. And so there is this important polarity we need to look at clinically in every organ between the life activities and the consciousness activities going on in that organ. And that will be important for any disease process that we look at. But helping to regulate all of these 4 levels of organization, or thinking about those 4 levels, allows us to develop a more nuanced and expanded idea of inner terrain. And that is really the basis of that salutogenic terrain way of thinking. So this is another reason I go into this, is to really develop a terrain model of thought, of medicine. We have to go into all 4 levels and ask, how do we maintain the terrain on the physical, the fluid, the gaseous, and the warmth? And only in that way can we develop a more comprehensive approach to the human being. So that's a little bit more on the modes of perception and the different levels of organization that we we perceive in the human body. In the next lecture, I'm going to go into specifically the fluid body and some of the scientific evidence that we now have for so-called classical interactions in the fluid body. And that's going to be very important because when we start to jump out of the physical earth way of knowing into the fluidic, we see there's a different level of relationships, laws really, that are at work in life that we don't see in the mineral. And this touches upon that whole vitalism mechanism debate. But I think with modern evidence, we can get beyond that and say there's a difference between what we might call classical effects from classical physics and chemistry and non-classical, or the dreaded word quantum effects, occurring at the fluidic level. And so next time I want to delve into some of the scientific evidence that we have for that. All right, well, thanks for listening. And as always, feel free to share, like, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. And feel free to leave your comments below in terms of any questions you might have or other topics you'd like me to explore in the future. Thank you very much.